capacity is a concept that I've struggled with over time. And sometimes we try to think about it using analogies, physical comparisons, such as this suitcase has the capacity for a week's worth of clothing, or this jar has the capacity for enough iced tea for the family. And so we try and think about it. Phil helps us when he defines it, because he says essentially capacity is about potential, how much is possible, as well as limitations. Where an organization, a schoolhouse or a district, will run into the limitations in its own structure and culture as it wants to go about changing and transforming. So thinking about potentials, what's possible, and limitations, how far you can go, is a starting point for us. And we've gone further. I think that the Schlechty Center tries to help schools and districts think through and assess their own capacity by saying there are 6 categories of indicators they might think about. And these are categories of indicators, and they're essentially, is there clarity of purpose and value? And that has to do with, are there vehicles in place? Are there artifacts in place? Are there regular conversations about what is essential in the organization? What matters most to them? And then, of course, has the capacity been built for others to understand and know it? The second category of capacity indicators is related. And it has to do with, is there a sense of direction? Do people know if they're going north, south, east, or west? Not exactly the itinerary, but is there the capacity for folks in an organization when they want to act to touch base with where they're headed and say, is this part of our direction or not? So again, the capacity might be evident in statements, in leaders who have captured, where they're headed, what they hope for the next 10 years, 20 years, and then people can reference that. The third category of capacity indicators has to do with leadership commitment. And it asks, have there been experiences and are there processes whereby leaders across the district come together around their direction and around their purpose and clarity of values? I give an example of a lack of capacity in that area. If an organization doesn't have a vehicle for bringing those leaders together regularly and as part of their conversations to discuss where they're headed and what matters most, if there aren't forums for that, the lack of forums would definitely be a lack of capacity in terms of leadership commitment. And I probably should have mentioned this one before. It's very important, and it's a fourth category, and that's assessment mechanisms. Are there processes in place, and has there been expertise developed in order to track where are we in our journey of transformation and change relative to where we want to be? And it goes way beyond numbers. Numbers are important. How are kids doing on national tests? But it also has to do with, for instance, questions like, do we know how much collaboration is going on in schools across the district? Do we know how parents view our direction and if they're with us on the journey? So having those mechanisms in place is a category of capacity. The fifth one of 6 is our capacity. Do we have an infrastructure for taking action? Are there ways to get things done? And we're not talking about what has been done. We're talking about, are there ways to get things done when you want to? For instance, in the district and in schoolhouses, are there processes for inviting new staff members to become full members in the organization? Are there ways that happen that are clear and apparent? If there aren't, and all of a sudden you're hiring 100 new teachers a year, or even 50 new teachers a year, and there are not processes in place, we would say you don't have the capacity for taking action in that area. And finally, the last category is, to what extent is there capacity to be flexible in use of resources? You could have processes in place for taking action. For instance, you could have a process in place whereby a schoolhouse, a principal, could put their hands on the budget for the school, and look at it and have discussions about it, and the whole thing could be laid out for them. But if there weren't opportunities for that principal to raise questions and look for flexibility in particular line items in that budget, then we'd say that capacity in that particular instance is lacking. So just to recap for a minute, 6 categories of capacity are important to think about. Clarity of purpose and values, sense of direction, assessment mechanisms, leadership commitment, infrastructure for taking action, and flexible use of resources, or flexibility in use of resources.